There we go.
Gosh, the internet's ready.
All right. It's 5 p.m. in the Pacific time zone today, Thursday, July 8th. Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Rogers. I'm here with Kirsten Campbell and our special guest, Shantae Marie Howard.
Hello.
Our topic today is ethics in the future of work. And that's a pretty big topic for, an hour, but we're going to chop it up and dice it and spit it out and see what we come up with. But before we jump into it, we have our viewing audience, as I shared last week. We are just huge in Asia and Europe, and starting to make headways into Middle East and Africa. And I want to ask our audience if they have any ideas for topics that we should discuss, that they would like us to discuss. So please, feel free to put a message in the chat, and so we can add it to our backlog, because we have an ever-growing list of topics to discuss, because the future of work is such a voluminous topic. So that said, we have a special guest, and we should probably give her an opportunity to introduce herself. Shantae, will you please share with the internet people who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Hi, I am Shantae Howard. I go by Shantae Marie. I am an HR specialist. I also work in accounting and finance. I work with small companies. I help them strategize and implement plans in order to create a better workspace for all. And I am happy to be here.
Fantastic. Well, you're well suited to discuss the future of work. But with regards to this topic of ethics, I kind of jokingly mentioned in our little promo that it's going to go the way of privacy, or it might go the way of privacy, because personal privacy, do you remember? I might be aging myself, but there used to be like white pages, and everybody's name and phone number was in there, sometimes their address. And you had the option of like not having your phone number there because people didn't want to, give away too much personal information. Now you look at like the world with Facebook, et cetera, it's just kind of ridiculous. So it's kind of quaint now. It's people like millennials, or I should say Gen Zers, probably don't even remember that, or they're not even aware of it. But ethics, on the other hand, is like a whole different ball of wax, because it's really, it's sort of the difference between right and wrong, and it borders on morals. And actually, that's where we should start. Like, what is the difference between ethics and morals? I'll let either one of you guys sort of jump in on that. And I'm asking the audience as well. So
asking the audience as well. Well, yeah, I think it's just that. Ethics is doing the right thing. They do kind of intertwine a lot too also, but ethics is more of doing the right thing, setting those boundaries so that it's equal for all. Morals, I feel is more geared towards your values, what you value.
Bingo. Kirsten, do you want to expound on that?
I thought that was a beautiful definition, but I think just to add to that, it's more like, especially now and into the future of work, I think we're going to be seeing those converge a lot more. Like, people will be hiring more for values and stuff like that. And so I think it might sort of seep into our lives a little bit more in that sense.
Yeah, my understanding was always like ethics was more sort of individual, like, this guy has a code of ethics. He would never, like Clint Eastwood in those spaghetti westerns. Whereas morals is more societal. It's like this group sees things this way and this group sees things that way. And, you know, when actually Kirsten suggested that we discuss ethics, my first thought went to, you know, AI, the ethics of AI and artificial intelligence. And, you know, if you look at, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole quite yet, but I just wanted to share. It's like we in the US have this idea of right and wrong and propriety about how things should be done. But other countries, and I'm speaking with regards to artificial intelligence, not so much. And for those, I'm a tech guy, so I kind of pay attention to this, but like over in China, I mean, we're in like an arms race in terms of artificial intelligence between the US and China. And the Chinese have a huge leg up because here people are worried about their privacy and their data. And over there, it's not a concern. The government backs all this stuff and the government can take whatever data they want, which means, are we going to, you know, bring a fight to a gun battle? Or are we going to, you know, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying we're fighting with one arm tied behind our back. So maybe that will lead to the demise of ethics, like the dodo bird. So I'm putting that out there for you guys to think about. And there's also, because in my research for this, I'm not sure I agree with this, but there's supposedly 3 parts to the discipline of business ethics. The personal, which is like the ethics, then there's professional on an intermediate scale, and then corporate on a macro scale. Does that sit well with you guys? Like, I'm not settled on it.
I think it's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Christian.
I was going to say, I think it's cagey. That's my first impression, is like, that's very cagey if you want to try to have these little silos of like, why does everything have to have a label? Why does everything have to have a separate name? Doing the right thing. If you start getting into like, how can we split hairs, then you're ultimately not trying to do the right thing. Doing the right thing is really easy for a business to do. And that's where, like, when you start delineating into these little buckets, then to me already I'm like, ding, ding, something's up. But I would love to hear an HR person's thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I'd be curious to see what you're seeing as the differences. Like, obviously we have our personal ethics, right, of what's right and wrong. It's not right, it's wrong to steal, you know, and so it's, you know, you want to always do the right thing. In corporate versus professional or personal, it can get mucky, right? Because, you know, there are those different levels and people see things very differently, depending on their position, depending on their roles, depending on a lot of different factors. So it could go a lot of different ways with that.
Sure. We could have an ethical person who's working for an unethical company.
That is true.
You know, and then they'll say, well, I was just doing my job or just following orders.
Yeah, where have we heard that one before?
Yeah, exactly. Or you would hope that somebody would say, I'm not doing that, and just walk out. But I think that's the exception, not the norm. And it's kind of like that Stanford experiment where they had the scientists, Shantae, I don't know if you're familiar, that they made a movie out of it. They had like a person come in and sit at a control board with a knob, and they told them there was a person in the other room tied up to these electrodes, or and they could turn up the voltage and basically shock the person. And so the experiment, I guess, subject was really the person turning the knob. And there was a guy in a white coat with a lab, you know, a notepad saying, turn it up to 20, turn it up to 30. And they would hear the person start screaming on the other wall. They didn't see him, he just heard it. They said 40, 50. And it was crazy how many people would keep doing it, even though they were clearly inflicting pain.
Oh, wow. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. Did I describe it correctly, Kristen?
I don't think they actually had a person hooked up. From my recollection,
didn't.
actually just had the sound. So it was the sound of somebody screaming, but there was actually nobody there. But
Right.
it would be like, if somebody in authority tells you to do something, most people are going to do it and not question what it is or the morality of it, which goes back to like obedience, leadership, like all those other things. But yeah, the ethics of like, this doesn't seem like a great idea to be like shocking somebody, even if they're like ultimately not real, but it's just that like, it was most shocking to people that had no problem with it and would just blindly do it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting that they would inflict pain or go against their own personal ethics, so to speak, for the purposes of the experiment. Was there a reward at the end of it? Like what did they receive from that?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, these people volunteered, presumably. I mean, maybe they got paid, but I think it was on Stanford. It was at Stanford, so they got.
Stanford did a lot of weird, like their prison experiment. I don't know what ethics were happening in that university at the time, but like when they did something similar with animals, it actually showed that animals have more empathy and they wouldn't hurt the other animal. They would actually share their food with the other animal if they didn't get like kibbles and stuff like that. And so it's hilarious to me that like animals were better at this experiment than humans were.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting to me because I would think that if there was some type of reward, like, if you do what we say for X amount of time, you get $50 or whatever, people might tend to overlook their own personal values in order for the reward. Versus, I know a lot of people, if you said, do this and I'm doing it and I realize I'm inflicting pain, I'm going to stop. Right. And so I'm just wondering what the driving motive was.
Yeah, it's I think we're assuming that the subject, the person turning the knobs, and the knobs didn't do anything, but they didn't know that. We're assuming that they weren't masochists or sadists or whatever. I'm sure a percentage of them were, but that kind of goes to the first question or the next question, which I'll put out to the audience. 60% of workplace misconduct involves someone with managerial authority. So what guardrails could be implemented to mitigate this? Shantae?
That is a good question. First and foremost, you have to set clear guidelines, and I personally feel that it needs to be one, verbal and also written. So whether that is you have a written code of ethics, whether most companies have like an employee handbook or something to that effect, but you have very clear guidelines on what is acceptable for your organization and what is not. You'd be very, very, very surprised how many people assume or think things are understood, and then you come to realize that they're not understood. We're not on the same page with a lot of things. So it's important to definitely set clear guidelines. Yeah, but also not only just to stop there, it's also to monitor those guidelines, right? You have reviews, follow up, especially on the managerial level. Peer reviews are very important. I'm a fan of 360 reviews so that everybody can give their input, and then you monitor how well the manager is, and then you adjust accordingly.
So can you describe for those who aren't familiar with 360 review, what that is?
Yep, the reviews that are given to, sometimes they can be done as peer reviews. Sometimes they're done, given to your staff if you have a staff that works under you. And those are just reviewing how you are as a leader and how you are as a manager. So it could let you know how people see you for the type of work that you do.
So everybody's reviewing everybody else.
Everybody should be reviewing everybody else. Managers should be reviewed just as the employees and staff should be reviewed. We all should be reviewed annually at minimum. I like 6-month reviews. I like to know where I'm at halfway through the year so I can adjust. But at minimum, I think everybody should be reviewed once a year.
Yeah, once a year seems silly to me. Like, shouldn't it be like once a month? Like, hey, this meeting we had, you rocked that. Good job. Oh, that other meeting, you could have like done this or done that better. But if it's like once a year, it's pointless.
Well, a formal review once a year. But, rule of thumb is you should never go into a review not knowing what to expect or what you hear. So you should always be giving consistent feedback as things are going. So yes, essentially you would be not maybe formally reviewed once a month, but you should be getting constant feedback.
All right. And these handbooks, I mean, do people actually read those? I guess they've been notified. Here's your handbook. You're responsible for everything in it. You know, be a good corporate citizen. And then if they cross the line, then you can tell them that they were informed, or like, how does that work in reality?
In reality, most people probably do not read the handbooks. You give it to them, they sign the back saying that they've received it, and they tuck it away, never to be heard of again until there's something that happens and then they need it. So just always given, again, just consistent feedback on everything that's going on and just communicating will definitely help so that people are aware of what's going on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what do you think, Kirsten, about guardrails to mitigate misconduct from management?
I completely agree with you, Shantae. But to go a step further, I would also add in there actually have to be visible consequences to it, because guardrails without any teeth to back them up are just suggestions. And it's that, like, you know, if there are enough whispers in the office about somebody being a creep or, you know, low-key racist and stuff like that, like, rather than giving that person the benefit of the doubt constantly, now they need to face up to what that is. And so that's where, like, having that employee guidebook is phenomenal, because then it's really easy. It's that tangible, like, here's what we stand for. People like us do things like this. You're not doing that, you know? And so that's the type of thing where I think it would be great to have the honesty and the transparency of, like, this is why we got rid of so-and-so, because we had enough complaints about this or whatever, because then people can see that line of, like, here's the guidebook, here's how it's actually being executed in real life.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, Kristen. Too many times there are no consequences for the actions of the managers. And so it often makes the employees feel like they can't come forward and complain about things because they feel, well, nothing's going to change. I've heard that all too many times of nothing's going to change. So no, that's
well, and there's already, like, a huge power imbalance. Like, I mean, looking at that stat, 60% of workplace misconduct involves somebody in leadership. Like, the fact that your leader is either telling you or suggesting that you maybe do something shady or that maybe doesn't work for you, you're already in a disadvantaged position. And so now you're like, oh God, and you're sort of in this, like, horrible, awkward position. And that's where, like, I would argue that leaders should be held to a higher standard because they wield such power over others. And yeah, as much as you're just following orders, in a way, it's sort of that, like, all right, now you've got to sort of untangle all these sticky power structures. And so that's something that I would really love to see in the future of work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just on this handbook, it's like, I assume that usually, no, you don't start these things from scratch if you have to create one. But like for a new business, I mean, you're trying to project into the future, like all the things that people might do wrong. And it's supposed to be based on, like, what is our company about? What do we expect from our people? Culture, vision, behavior. Like, how do you anticipate everything? Or you don't, and it's like a living document that keeps changing? I'm just curious.
It's a living document that keeps changing. There are some basics that kind of go into your HR handbook. You know, you're going to have your sexual harassment policies. You're going to have some of the basics of, you know, what our work schedule is, maybe what your wardrobe is, depending on your industry. There are all these basics that you can anticipate, but then there are always going to be things that are going to happen that you're not going to anticipate, and you adjust accordingly. And that's how the the books grow. I'll give you an example. I was working with a client, and it was a student teacher situation, and the students felt harassed by the professor, by the instructor, because he was in class talking about how the students looked, commenting on their appearance, calling them names. He had made comments about his salary. And of course, you can't predict that, yes, in your handbook that these people, you can write, don't talk about your salary because those are things you think are understood. But what would happen is the students felt intimidated in some respects. You know, he had made comments that, well, you should feel happy and privileged and blessed that I'm, you know, helping you because this is what they're paying me, and quoted the amount. And it was just a very uncomfortable situation. And when I had to pull him to the side and say, hey, this isn't okay, he really didn't get it. And he really didn't understand why it wasn't okay. So it's just setting very clear boundaries about what you expect, what your mission is, what you represent, so that the people that work for you represent that in the highest light. But we did have to adjust the handbook, the code of ethics, to put in there very specific language of what not to do, which seems, yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, you shouldn't talk about your salary. But now, you know what? I have to put that. So yes, it does. It's an ever-changing document.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yes.
So that's a full-time job, just keeping that current.
It is.
Wow. So so I don't want to veer too much off, but do you like personality tests? Do you guys in the HR world, do you apply those to people applying for, no? Like, so it's just the normal interview to see if they're going to be a good fit. That's it.
Personally, I don't care for personality test because they can discriminate against people who score poorly on those tests. And so depending on your background, depending on your culture, you're going to answer questions very differently. And that can work against you. And it's not necessarily a clear sign of how well you'll do at work. If it's a test, if it's an assessment test that is just testing your skills, I'm all for that in a specialized field. But personality tests, I don't like those.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, a lot of tests are biased. People are just now sort of getting hip to that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, you know, what are the ethics of requiring these like narcissistic or sociopath tests when hiring for leadership roles? These same answer, or?
It's the same answer for me. It's the same answer for me.
What do you think, Kristen?
We're fighting now, Shantae. I'm sorry, we're fighting. I think the higher the level of leadership, the more necessary these tests are, because it's that, like, if you're the captain of the ship and you've got someone who's a literal sociopath in there, like, this isn't good for anybody. And so I think that the higher levels, yes, I'm not sure, like, you know, if you're just like manager of Starbucks, like, you probably don't need that, and that's maybe overkill. But if you're going to be heading up a Fortune 500 company or something, I think it's absolutely necessary, especially if you're dealing with other people's money, you're dealing with a charity, like those type of things where the ripple effect of harm could be so big. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by not having one in this day and age, because I think we would clean out a lot of garbage if we started requiring them, or maybe even like applying them retroactively and then going like, yeesh, and then having to maybe make some adjustments later.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So
sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's the idea is good. It really comes down to like the quality of the test. Is it a good test? And you know, tests of old frequently were written for a certain, you know, demographic. But so I think I agree with both of you. In my Zoom, I'm literally in between the two of you. So Kristen's hard left and Shantae's hard right. I'm the voice of reason for once. Oh, wow, it's crazy.
The stabilizing force, Joe. That's terrifying.
But it's, you know, it makes sense. I mean, I've often wondered, like, not to diverge or digress, but like, I don't know what kind of tests police go through. And I'm, you know, I've had experiences with police, both good and bad. I know there's most cops are good, but you know, when I deal with the ones who aren't good or kind of jerks, it's like, wow, how did you get past, you know, how did you get hired? Yeah, I always wonder, and I know nothing about, you know, the process to the application process or what hoops they have to jump through. But yeah, that's a whole different ball of wax.
I can go down a rabbit hole, but yes, I'm not familiar with the test either, but I would assume that they can probably answer the questions in the way that they feel you want them to answer, right? Which is also kind of a problem with these tests sometimes. It's because I know what you want me to say. It might not necessarily be what I feel or what I believe.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
For context, most cops in the US have less training than hairdressers. So that would also, just for context, give you an idea of perhaps what they're not learning and what they're not testing for, like empathy, humanity, things like that. And so I think there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. Like if you were to like look, for example, compared to like Scandinavia, it's their policing academies, like I think like 3 or 4 years. And
Wow.
so that's just immediately a deterrent for somebody who isn't interested in that kind of commitment. And so that alone is a wonderful test to be able to just separate people who like genuinely want to do the job and people who just want to feel important and have a badge and a gun. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in the future of work, I mean, this actually isn't a digression at all. It actually makes total sense. Sort of, but again, the testing or the requirements need to be proper and unbiased. So that,
because it does make sense ethically that if a lawyer has to spend like 8 years learning the law and how to apply it, ethically, to me, it would make sense that the person who's actually doing it day to day, and sorry for the poor choice of words, but executing those laws and those rules on a daily basis, to me, it makes logical sense that they should be about the same. I mean, like, if I have to learn it for 7, 8 years and some guy just gets a gun and gets to go run around and apply those laws, that doesn't fly with me.
right. Yeah. It's interesting. You're absolutely, yeah, the cops, yeah, that's a very, I mean,
I think that's reasonable. Like, I think ethically, I think that's a reasonable assumption and request to make. No?
absolutely.
It'll also weed out a lot of people who want to be cops that don't necessarily have the right intentions. If they're going to have to put extra time and effort into it, they're probably not going to go in that field.
It's true. It weeds out the bad actors.
Bad apples, yes.
Help the bad apple as much as we can.
Sure, sure. I saw a video once of a guy protesting. The guy protesting was white, but and there were cops, and he was just like saying all these horrible things about cops into this cop's face. And the cop was like telling him to do stuff, and the guy was not complying. And the guy took off running. Like the cop's like, all right, that's it. I'm gonna put handcuffs on you. And the guy took off running, and the cop chased him. And he was younger, the cop was older. And the guy ran in a big loop back to where all the cops were, like, because there was multiple. And like you could tell he was like the sergeant, sort of the commanding officer. And he just told the other cops, stop. And he's like, yeah, but he was saying this and that. He's like, stop. He's like, but he's like, basically, he was on public property, and the cop had to explain to him that the guy could say whatever he wanted on public property. So he should not have been arrested, or the other cop was wrong. And it was like, that's kind of, you know, the cops clearly need to know the rules, and otherwise they're making stuff up. And it's great to see, you know, cops step in and say and straighten out the other cop, like, who doesn't know. And exactly. I think that happens a lot. I have no doubt about that. But it's definitely, you know, that applies in the office too. Like managers will see other managers do stuff and they don't say anything. Mm-hmm. That's a whole, you know, in my consulting career, I've seen a lot of interesting things. And I was always sort of an outside participant or just like a fly on the wall. And because I was an outsider, working alongside these people, oftentimes for extended durations, I became the trusted, confidant, and I would learn more about what was going on than the people who worked there. And of course, I had to keep it, private, but it was very, very interesting ethically. Like, some of the, thank heavens, I'm an ethical person because I often knew stuff before other people. Just keep my mouth shut. So yeah, there we go. So how does remote work impact ethics? Kirsten, would you like to?
I think it's going to propose a new challenge for, I guess, logistics. Because if you think about it, like most shady shit probably happens in the office when it's that like you can feel body language, you can feel the vibe of like, what if we just, like those kind of conversations are a lot more difficult to have on like Zoom, for example. Like creative accounting conversations are difficult to have on Zoom. No one's going to be dumb enough, hopefully, to put it in writing, like for an email or something like that. So in a way, it could actually help drop the amount, but then it's also possible that people could then find a way to use that to shield whatever shady stuff they're doing. So in that respect, it could go either way. But Shantae, come on, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. You'll be surprised what people actually write down on paper. You would be surprised the emails that I've seen. People incriminate themselves all the time. But I think that privacy is a big one with remote work, and also just kind of fairness. And I think they kind of go hand in hand, because with a lot of companies, we're using these like remote monitoring systems to help monitor, like your data security and, employee productivity. And so what ends up happening is certain people can be targeted of, okay, well, we're going to look at this person's more than maybe that person based off, could be someone's biases if they misuse it. And so you'll see a lot of that, but also a lot of working remote, sometimes people can get forgotten. So like those people that maybe need a little extra attention, a little extra hand holding, working from home, you don't realize that Shelly in accounting might not really know what she's doing or understand what's going on. And maybe Shelly doesn't feel comfortable to reach out and ask. And so what ends up happening is you have people that are being as productive working from home, and then they can to be neglected. Like if you get busy, sometimes we all get busy, so you don't think maybe to check in on those people. So remote can be good because you do have the flexibility, for companies now, especially post COVID, they're moving more towards remote work because they're realizing that, hey, we don't have all these overhead costs because you're working from home. But what if the person's home situation isn't a good situation to work from? Maybe they have home violence. Maybe they have shitty internet. Maybe they don't have the money to buy these things in order to improve their work performance. And then that can be seen on the other end as they're not being productive, but maybe they are if they had better circumstances.
It's very interesting. My business WorkDone is all about what you just described, but I'm not gonna plug it.
Well, you do have the ethical component baked in, which I do think merits at least a ping of like recognition, because like AI ethics are one of the things, like it's like when it comes to AI, the ethical part is the last part that anybody ever wants to think about. It's like cleaning up, the party after the kids have left, and that's a nightmare. Nobody ever wants to think about it. And so that's where I think, like, from an ethical perspective, that is a competitive advantage for you.
You're referring to our efforts to help displaced workers get back on their feet and transition to their next area of vitality. Yeah, no, that's part of WorkDone's core, because we know we're gonna put some people out of work, and we need to make sure we need to do our best to help them get into something that ideally isn't just a job, but something they care about. But yeah, so thank you for that. But you mentioned COVID. Is full-time work in an office ethical in a post-COVID world? Either of you?
It really, again, just kind of really depends on the industry. It depends on the organization. It depends on the culture. And a couple of the organizations that I'm associated with, we're going back full time because that's what makes sense for us, especially in like, so I work a lot with in entertainment. And so in that, it made more sense for us to all be in the same space. One, because we have to film, but two, when we're not filming or actually post during COVID, what we found was a lack of communication with everybody. There were a lot of balls being dropped. There were things being missed. And that goes to company culture and communication. But certain companies have issues with that. And so people are more effective and efficient when they're actually together. And not necessarily in a micromanagey way, but just some people just work better in an office setting.
It really depends on the industry, yeah.
Industry, I think, plays a big part. At some industries, you can work remote and be effective and efficient. And, all's gravy, sun shining, flowers are blooming. But in some industries, it's hard.
Sure. What do you think, Kirsten? Is full-time work in an office ethical in a post-COVID world?
I think in companies that could easily go 100% remote, then yes. Like if you're in big tech, if you're working at one of those, the monster tech companies and stuff like that, like it's so easy to just not. And you know that the only reason the executives want people back is because it's their little fiefdom. And so knowing that it's motivated by ego instead of productivity, like as you mentioned, Shantae, like obviously there are industries where like you do need to be in the office, you do need to be in close proximity, and people are able to kind of feed off of each other energy wise and like knowledge and stuff like that. But to have everybody go back and sit in an open office just so that the boss can be back in the corner office and we can go back to life as usual, because like a lot of people probably won't end up being vaccinated. So now that has an ethical question of like, are you now going to force me to go sit in an open office space with a bunch of coworkers who may or may not have been vaccinated when we don't even have to be here? So that would piss me off if I was an employee at like Facebook or whatever, and they demanded we all ended up back at the office when it's like, why? Like, why do we have to do this? And so that I think is the unethical part. I think they have to at least do the best to mitigate and create, a hybrid environment that can work for people, like whatever that would look like. But I think from an overarching, like if you can, and the only reason that you're demanding that people go back is for like culture, that's not a good enough reason. I think like, as you mentioned, like for your industry, like for entertainment, like, yeah, you do, because you have to. But if the only reason is for culture, I think that's horrible.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then just to add, you can't force somebody to come into the office if they are not vaccinated, at least as of right now. That is a lot. You cannot force somebody to get a vaccination. You can't even ask them legally. Well, it's advised not, you can't ask them if they're like, you can't say, hey, Joe, did you get vaccinated today? But what you can do is say, if, set rules is if you're vaccinated, these are the rules that you can comply with. And then you need to submit your card if you feel comfortable or encouraged to do so. If you don't, then the company has to provide reasonable accommodations for the people that don't. So I can't force you to come into an office in an open space if you're really adamant against not coming in because of COVID.
But you can't fire them.
I can't. It depends on, I can't fire you because you say you don't want to get vaccinated. I have to give you the opportunity to be able to work in a space that you're not there. However, if the work requires that you're on site, like if you're a construction worker, for example, obviously you can't do construction work from your living room. So if you're a construction worker and our rule is in order to be on site, you have to have a vaccination card, which we can do. And you say, hey, for religious reasons, you don't even have to tell me it's for religious reasons. You can just say, I don't want to give you my vaccination card. Then if what you do, I can't make accommodations to you working remotely, then yes, at that case, I can let you go.
Interesting.
But I-
So there was the case of this hospital down in Houston where a lot of the staff, the nurses, this was like 2-3 weeks ago. They didn't want to get the vaccine, so the hospital cut them loose. Did you guys hear about that?
I didn't
Okay.
hear.
Yeah. And I was kind of surprised. It seemed like a bit of a stretch. I mean, to just fire them all because they didn't want to get the vaccine.
It
But
causes a threat to the patients. If they don't get vaccinated and they, God forbid, contact COVID and give it to a patient, then
That's a liability issue, isn't it?
mhm.
I see. But that's in a hospital where you might infect the patient, but in a workplace where you might infect your coworker, it's not, the liability doesn't exist.
Well, I'd have to make arrangements for you to be able to work elsewhere. So yes, it depends. You can come in. So in the place where I'm at now, full time, our rule is if you want to submit your vaccination card, it is up to you. You can submit your card, but for those who have a vaccination card on file, you're not required to wear a mask inside. If you do not want to submit your card, which is your right, and then you are required to wear a mask at all times, and you are required to continue with the guidances of OSHA and social distance and all of these things. So we just have separate rules that we put into place. And so if you don't want to wear a mask, then you have to submit your vaccination card. If you're against that, that's your right, but you will have to, continue to wear your mask inside, continue to social distance, and etc.
Okay. So it's like we were talking earlier, it kind of depends on the industry, which makes it sound like ethics is kind of adjustable, which, seems weird. It seems like it should be absolute, but like it's the doctors take the Hippocratic oath to not do any harm, or if somebody's hurt, they got to help them, and to try to keep information confidential, and do no harm. I think that was Google actually back in the beginning. But anyway, so since that industry has a Hippocratic oath, do you think there should be a similar idea in the tech world?
I think there should be an oath to not do any harm. To what extent? I mean, again, it's subjective, right? So I'm curious to see your views on that, Joe. But I would think, again, it kind of depends on the industry. I mean, working in film, it's unethical to probably read people's emails. But if you work for the CIA, it might be ethical to read your emails because you might be monitoring for terrorist activity. So it really depends. What do you think?
Yeah, it's I hate to say it, but it is subjective. I once had a client whose CIO read people's emails, like because he could. And it was like, oh my God, I'd never seen that before. It was one of these, like, blew my mind. It's I just mentioned a second ago, when Google started, their motto was "Do no evil."
It was don't be evil.
Huh?
It was don't be evil.
Don't be evil? I thought it was "Do no evil." Don't be evil? Okay. And then maybe, I don't know, this is a while ago now, maybe like 10 years ago, they actually changed it. Like, really?
Yeah, I wonder what's going on there. But to add to that, if
We disagree.
If you look at the most dystopian everything, any literature, anything dystopian, the fact that today the company that has worth the most money, Amazon, worth the most money, pays no tax, treats their workers like absolute garbage. The fact that their logo is a smile is so dystopian, it's poetic. I kind of love it as much as it makes me want to smash my head in with something. And so, to your point of ethics of being sort of a sliding scale, if you like somebody's like, again, like I've mentioned before, of like the number one shoplifted item in America is baby food. That to me is slightly less horrifying than like that. You're like, okay, I get that. You're like, I can see desperate people do desperate things. But then if you're like, oh, you stole money from a charity for children, like, oh, and that was for your second boat. Like there's like, to me, that's one of like an easily applicable, like, okay, like the sliding scale of morality is a little bit different there in that sense of like looking at the broader context. But like going back to the tech part, I think that applies in the sense of like how far reaching Google is. Like, have you ever looked at the back end of your Google data? It's like everything you've ever done for the past 15 years, they have. And so that's the like the ethical part of like, I'm not surprised they took it off of their slogan because of all the like nefarious gross shit they're doing. And so now it's like, now they don't have to be accountable to it because it's no longer their slogan. So ethical conundrum.
Exactly. But see, that's the issue I have with assessment tests because, or personality tests, because it is such a sliding scale. I once did not get a job because one of the questions on the test, and they asked it, I think 3 different ways, but it was, is it okay to steal bread or if you're homeless or something to that effect? And I think I said yes, because in my mind, I was like, well, if, I'm thinking about all the homeless people outside, living on the streets, they're starving. There's this loaf of bread. I have this whole thing envisioned in my head. There's this loaf of bread sitting on the corner and they just kind of run by and steal it because they're hungry and they have to feed their children. So is that okay? Is that ethical to steal the bread in that case? Or is it unethical? And yeah, so I didn't get the job, but it does. It is quite interesting.
Did they check your purse on the way out?
An X-ray machine. They do it on the way out. Although I did hear that, or I was reading something of like, I think it was during Katrina, the cops would put food into open cars. And then when starving people would go in and take it, they would arrest them for stealing.
I didn't hear about that. That's crazy.
Oh.
Yeah. So that's something where you're like, yeah, technically they're stealing, but given the sense that like, the city's underwater and there's a whole disaster going on, like, is anybody really going to miss that loaf of bread sitting in a car that probably no one's going to eat? Probably not. And so that opens up a whole new can of worms of ethics right there.
Sure.
You to set people up to be able to.
It's called entrapment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like job, do a real job, like actually do something.
Yeah, yeah. So it's I mean, yeah, it's interesting that they would give you these different shades of gray. It's not black or white. It's like, well, this is like sort of 50% gray and that's 45% gray, and it's oftentimes, I mean, the reality of it is it's like with the case of say autonomous cars, the people programming the AI need to make a decision if there's a kid darting out from between some cars chasing a ball, and maybe there's like an elderly lady in the crosswalk and you can't avoid both of them, who do you hit, and like the AI needs to decide that in sub-second time. And it's like there's different schools of thought. Some will say, well, it should be 50-50, just sort of random. Other people are like, well, the old lady had a good life, so save the kid. And but who knows, maybe that kid, we just ran his background, he's going to grow up to be Hitler, so we don't want that, let's take him out. I mean, it's kind of that last one I just made up, but it's like it's not, there's no easy solution, there's no easy answer, and that happens a lot, especially in AI. And I don't know, it's the Hippocratic oath for tech companies would be, it's hard because imagine if it was for gun manufacturers, because they like to say guns don't kill people, people kill people. Cars kill people, people drink alcohol and get in a car and cause problems. It's like, how do you, it's really challenging. I don't have anything really astute to say on that. I'm just blathering at this point.
Seems like reductive reasoning, because then you could go as like, well, if we were never born, then we would never have guns, and like you can do that, you can play that game forever, as opposed to actually just taking responsibility and being like, yeah, guns don't need to do XYZ in 2021. Like, you don't need this in being sold at the corner store where you can get liquored up and go buy a gun. Like, this probably isn't in anyone's best interest, like, and even like with the ethics of self-driving cars and stuff like that, like someone's gonna have to program that. And I would rather know that the person who's programming that actually has an eye towards ethics and is committed to what that is in some capacity. Like, who knows what that would mean and what that would look like. But in the same sense that, like, if a doctor kills somebody, like, yeah, granted they have insurance and they have malpractice insurance and all that kind of jazz and like bureaucracy, so probably not all that much would happen to them. But at the end of the day, it's that, like, it's still on your license. You killed somebody, like, you're the doctor that did that. And I think if tech would have a little bit of that accountability so that you could sort of draw the string of like, oh, so-and-so was responsible for this like wonderfully racist, hair dryer thing that doesn't turn on unless you're a certain skin color. Like, being able to sort of attach people to the product, I think would help with a lot of tech bias and the stuff that's baked into it, is because now, like, the people who are programming it have no empathy. And the people who are programming it are usually usually the ones using it, and they have no concept of everybody else who is also using it. And so I think as part of the ethics of the Hippocratic Oath for tech that I think they should do, I think it should also be like mandatory empathy. Like, you're a white guy and you're a software engineer at Google, congratulations. Here's an avatar of a Black woman, and you're going to go use it on Twitter for a month, and you're going to get every rape threat, every death threat, every disgusting thing that happens to regular people on the internet that the people who program our things don't experience. I think that would be a really important part for the ethical component of a Hippocratic Oath for tech, is actually seeing how the other half lives.
But like you said earlier, Kirsten, it's, there has to be real consequences. So who is going to hold these people accountable? Who would be able to hold them accountable for the actions if they did go mad and, create these unfortunate things?
Yeah. So this reminds me of in China, I mean, this is old news now. They have this score, like everyone has a social score. Like, if you're someone who jaywalks a lot, your score goes down. But if you like help an old lady across the street because they got cameras everywhere, you get brownie points. And it means like whether or not you can get a mortgage for your house or whatever. And it's pretty dystopian, but it's like it's a level of transparency and accountability that, I'm not in favor of it, but there are some positives to it. And I don't know. I look at, the government over there, whatever. I mean, it's very much here in the US, they talk about the political will to get something done, or political capital. And at a certain point in time, you run out of capital and then you can't get anything done. And our system is so, log jammed, blocked up anyway. But I'll never forget, and this is an aside, I had a couple projects in Hong Kong, and I actually, remember the old airport. And when I first landed at the new airport, it was at the baggage claim was about 100 steps from the subway to take you into downtown, into Central. It blew my mind. I'm like, oh my God. In Los Angeles, they can build a subway a mile away, but then, the taxis have to get their piece. So yeah, it was just like so incredible. Like I admired that they could get that done and make it happen. And everybody had to just deal with it, as opposed to kind of the silliness that we often encounter because of special interests. And there's, I think it's crazy unethical, you know? Like we're spending all this money to build a subway, but it doesn't go into the airport. Ugh. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox there. So let's see, last topic is AB5, legislation in California that requires companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, all those sort of gig companies that hired people as independent contractors they're going to have to reclassify them as employees. Any thoughts on from you or our internet audience on the appropriateness or ethicality of that?
Yeah, AB5 has been a hot topic here in California. When it started, it was, yes, to try to help companies like drivers for Uber and Lyft in order to make sure that they got fair wages, that they got health insurance. But I think what they didn't account for is all of the different industries that it actually affects and the people that it affected. And sometimes in not necessarily the best way. I've seen mixed reviews. Obviously, having health insurance benefits is always a great thing, but I'll use entertainment as an example. In entertainment, working in theater, the basis for people having to be employees now is essentially that everybody is considered under AB5. Everybody is considered an employee unless you can prove that you're an independent contractor, which the smaller guy can't, right? Because they don't qualify under the rules. Their work is associated with the core business of the company because they're either actors or they're in tech within the organization. They're electricians. There are all these things that are needed within the corporation. They're not free from control because we essentially are telling them when they need to be at work, what they need to do. And also they're not in specialized fields. So what ends up happening is these people have to come onto payroll, and some of these people aren't necessarily used to working for employees. So now we have to track their hours. Now we get to tell them when they have breaks. Now we get to control their work weeks. So in some cases where you may say, hey, I need this costume for this film, I need it by Friday, you can work at your leisure and get it done. Just get it to me Friday by 4. Now I have to say, well, you know what? You have 10 hours in which to complete this project. So you have to get it done within that space. It limits them. And so I don't think California took that into, I know they didn't take that into consideration when they were making this rule. They were thinking, oh, hey, people need benefits. People are getting hurt on the job. They need workers' comp. But what ends up happening now is these companies that can't afford to necessarily pay benefits have to cut their hours. And honestly, I believe they get paid a little bit less now because now I'm going to pay you minimum wage, which in California for small companies is $13.75 an hour. And so now you're getting paid $13.75 an hour, whereas you might have got paid $2,000 for that job. I'm going to pay you $13 an hour and you need to complete it in 10 hours because now I have to pay payroll taxes. I have to pay workers' comp. I have to pay all these additional fees that my company, maybe not doing it in a malicious way. Maybe I just can't afford to pay all these additional fees. So I have to cut your hours. And so it ends up not really being fair to those people that aren't businesses or corporations in their own right.
And what if the job takes 20 hours instead of 10 hours in reality?
What if it takes 20
Yeah, in reality, it would require 20 hours instead of 10. What happens?
By law, right? If you're an hourly employee, now you're an employee, I have to pay you for every minute that you work. So if you spend 20 hours on a job, I have to pay you for 20 hours. But you're probably going to get penalized for that later. Maybe I don't bring you back now because I told you to do it in 10, you did it in 20. So now I'm going to go find Sally who can do it in 10 hours. And now you lost out on the job.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So.
Oh, yeah. Kirsten, any input?
Someone who sits comfortably in Canada doesn't have to deal with that. It's very easy for me to weigh in on this as like, wow, that sounds ridiculous. But I can see where it's the like, this is a great idea in theory, but the people who make those rules and those laws don't actually work in the capacity that a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and stuff like that do. And so they just don't have any awareness of what that would actually look like in practice. Because on paper, I can imagine why they were like, this is a great idea. Like, we're helping everybody. But then the actual execution by the people that are out there on the ground, like boots on the ground doing it, I can imagine why they're like, oh my God, which again goes back to like, maybe they should have talked to those people a bit more before creating these legislations.
Right, exactly. And of course, there are advantages. I'm not going to totally, talk on it, but for example, you do get unemployment if you are in between jobs, whereas if you're an independent contractor, you can't get unemployment if you don't actually have work. But again, the unemployment is based off your work history. And so if you're only getting paid, $30 an hour, you're not getting a lot of money, but you do get those benefits. So it does help. But I'm finding that more people just like the autonomy better than having to be under control of an organization. And then there's the conflict of interest. You're in film. If I'm paying you as an employee, you can't work another project to offset. Maybe I don't want you to work with another company to offset, your wages, because that's my competing company. So you have, when you're employed with me, that's all you can do. So now you're restricted. So you can't necessarily make extra money.
But would that hold up in court? Can you stop somebody from working someplace else?
I can put it in your contract that if it's a conflict of interest, I have to prove it's a conflict of interest. But if it's a conflict of interest.
That's interesting. Okay. Wow. Well, I feel like we could keep going on this topic for a while. But we're 1 minute over. So any closing thoughts or this has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. Shantae?
Yeah, no, ethics, we could talk about literally for hours and hours, and I can go on and on, especially about AB5. I've been living and breathing it, but it is a great topic and I appreciate you bringing it up. And no, this has been great.
Wonderful. Kirsten,
This has been delightful. I've loved batting ideas around like this. The AB5 thing, I was like, okay, we need to have another session just about that because I'm already like, what is happening? So I made a note to drag you back for another time. And we talk about AB5 almost probably exclusively just because it sounds like there's a lot of nuance to that and it's going to apply to a lot of people, especially if it gets rolled out across the country. So I think there's a lot we could go into that, but like, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been amazing. And I really hope that you come back and lecture us about AB5 more because I have a lot of questions about that and I've made some notes.
No, absolutely. And it's going to be a thing. It's only in California and Nevada right now, but everybody is starting to really pick up on it. So it's going to be a thing in the next few years across the nation.
Wow.
Yes, I'm happy to come back.
Not aware of that. We'll definitely have you back. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, people out there in internet land. And
don't be evil. That's our parting words. Don't be evil.
That's my new motto. Don't be evil.
Don't be evil. It's a low bar. Don't be evil.
Okay. It's subterranean at this point, but yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.